Alright friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today we take a break from our Clone Wars history series to answer a message sent out by one of you guys. Dylan from North Carolina asks, Alan, why are you such a great person? And what would have happened had the Empire kept on using the clone troopers even after the Clone Wars? Well, Dylan, thank you for your question. The reason why I'm such a great person is because I destroy everyone around me. See, a tree will look a lot taller in a clearing rather than in a forest. I'm just joking. Don't do that. Love your fellow man and woman. The real source of my greatness actually comes from my beard. It hides all of my inadequacies. Anyway, to answer your second question, well, that's what we're going to do our video about today. What would have happened had Emperor Palpatine decided to keep on using the clone troopers after the rise of the New Order? First, let's take a look at why the clones were replaced in the first place. This will give us an idea of some of the disadvantages the Empire will face if they continue using the clones. The official reason the clones were discontinued was quite simple. The Camino cloning facilities had been shut down shortly after the end of the Republic. In Legends, the Kaminoans actually rebelled against the Empire as Palpatine began encroaching on their autonomy. This led to a brief but vicious battle between Imperial clones and Kaminoan loyalist clones. Either way, with the clone training pipeline disrupted, the remaining clones would serve out the rest of their lifespan as the last of their kind. But due to their advanced aging just 10 years after the war, a lot of clones are already biologically 40 years old and past their prime. Some clones were more resilient than others, of course, and a select few were still active in the Stormtrooper Corps during the Battle of Yavin. But that was just the surface reason why the clones were replaced. There were also security, political, and more importantly, economic issues that dictated their replacement. First, with security, every clone had an inhibitor chip placed inside their head by the Kaminoans. The ultimate purpose of these chips were to ensure the complete loyalty from the clones. This included executing Order 66, which meant killing their Jedi leaders. Now, obviously, this alone would have been a very suspicious order to find inside the clone's brain, so Palpatine actually created a list of 150 orders, which were known as the Contingency for the Grand Army of the Republic. These 150 orders took into account many different emergency scenarios, including several orders that were targeted at the executive power, which is what Chancellor Palpatine was. Because no one but Palpatine really knew about these secret orders, no one could really use it against him. That was until Order 66 happens, and everyone eventually found out about the contingency orders of the Grand Army of the Republic. The contingency orders could be executed by two governing bodies, the executive power, which was his office, and also the Senate. Palpatine, of course, didn't want the Senate to have these powers and saw the clones as a great threat to his own power. Now, the most important reason why the clones were replaced was the economic reason. After the Clone Wars, the galaxy was more or less completely devastated. It's something that the Clone Wars cartoons don't really do a good job of portraying, partly because it is a cartoon and not all that gritty and realistic. But the truth was, hundreds, if not thousands, of formerly productive worlds were completely destroyed beyond recognition. Billions on billions, if not trillions of Imperial citizens were out of work and living in impoverished conditions as refugees. To further complicate the situation, a lot of these worlds were former separatist worlds and had insurgency groups still on them. Of course, the biggest threat to any governing body is a high amount of unemployment. If left untreated, the unemployed will eventually turn into dissidents and potentially even armed rebels. After all, why would someone support a government that isn't even able to provide them with some basic services and job opportunities? The quickest way to create jobs is by creating government jobs. Basically, have the government jumpstart the economy by throwing massive amounts of public money into work programs. It's exactly what FDR did to pull the United States out of the Great Depression. You had worker programs like the WPA, which put millions of Americans back to work building infrastructure across the country. But in order to do these kind of government programs, the government actually needed to have a large amount of money. And the Republic, for all intents and purposes, was completely bankrupt. Although the initial batch of clones had already been paid for, the clones that followed, along with all of their weapons and equipment, were paid by the Republic out of pocket. The thing we have to remember is for almost 1,000 years, the Galactic Republic didn't have a standing army, so there were no funds really allocated for that purpose. And overnight, when the clone army appeared, they had to figure out a way to get the money. Even the best financial engineering can't cover such a large expenditure, so it comes to no surprise that the Republic was on the verge of bankruptcy by the third year of the Clone Wars. Without a federal banking system like we have here in the States, things were looking grim. But Palpatine, being the maniacal evil genius that he was, used his secret ties with the Separatist Alliance to create instability in the intergalactic banking clan worlds. This gave him a reason to seize control of the banking clans, which allowed him to establish a government-controlled banking system. Now Palpatine had a central bank with which he could financially engineer a recovery package for the galaxy. Now, there are several ways he could have started a recovery process. He could have started a work program similar to the one that FDR did, which focused on repairing infrastructure across the entire galaxy. He could have also lowered interest rates and encouraged worlds and businesses to rebuild themselves by borrowing money. But the path Palpatine ultimately chose was to create a massive military-industrial complex that supported an even larger military. Even though the clones were really skilled combatants, they were way too expensive for Palpatine's new government to be able to afford. Plus, he had millions upon millions of men and women who didn't have any jobs and were willing to do any job, including serving in the Stormtrooper Corps. Better yet, these men and women didn't need to be grown or raised, they were already there. And with the Separatist threat destroyed, the Empire didn't really need high-quality troops, they just needed quantity to keep order across the galaxy. So what if Palpatine had decided to keep the clone troopers? By all accounts, the clone troopers were superior to the stormtroopers in combat scenarios. Well, first, Palpatine would still need to speed up the rebuilding process on worlds damaged by the Clone Wars. Most likely, he would focus on rebuilding worlds in the core or the mid-rim that had strategic resources or industrial capabilities. The Kaminoan clones, while superior, were far too expensive to produce, and while the increased aging sped up the process of their growth, it also severely limited how long a clone could serve. It just wasn't a very practical type of soldier to employ. Palpatine would also look at alternative cloners that could produce clones at a cheaper and quicker rate with an acceptable loss of quality. In Legends, you had the Spartai clones, which took only a year to grow. They exhibited an increased rate of mental instability and were poor fighters when compared to the Kaminoan clones. But again, the Empire was looking for quantity, not quality. The Kaminoan clones would still be kept, of course, sans their inhibitor chips in their brain, and most likely be used as special forces. Even then, the Emperor would probably supplement his elite clone troopers with civilian soldiers. In Legends, the stormtroopers were actually shock troopers. The majority of engagements were actually not carried out by them, but by the more numerous Imperial Navy troopers and Imperial Army troopers. Han Solo was famously kicked out of flight school and assigned to an Imperial Army unit on the planet of Mimban. Because of their higher level training and special abilities in the battlefield, the clones would most likely be assigned to hunt down the Rebel Alliance. The clones were also genetically altered to be more obedient and loyal to the Empire. This meant that there was a smaller chance that they might defect to the rebellion, something that happened a lot more than Imperial leaders would like to admit. The clone troopers would present some unique problems for the rebel insurgents. For one, the clones were all identical copies of one another. They all shared similar physical features, voices, and even body movements. They were able to recognize each other even with all of their armor on. It'd be relatively difficult for rebels to infiltrate the clone trooper units in the same way the rebels could infiltrate a stormtrooper unit. However, the clones' shared biology would be a weakness that the rebellion would probably try to exploit. Some of the more extreme factions, like the Partisans, commanded by Saw Gerrera, probably wouldn't think twice about developing some kind of virus or bacteria that directly targeted the Fett DNA. How successful this would be is another matter. There have been attempts by Separatist scientists during the Clone Wars to create such biological weapons, and these weapons were all quite unpredictable and were much less selective than their creators had intended them to be. However, I do think the clone troopers will be a significant threat to the rebellion. They're a lot more dangerous, in my opinion, than the stormtroopers because of their obedience, discipline, and single-minded approach to combat. As a matter of fact, in canon, the last batch of clones to actually serve in the Empire served as a personal army for Darth Vader. These were known as Inquisitor Troops and were primarily used to hunt down the remaining Jedi still hiding in the galaxy. Although it should be noted that on Mount Cala, a group of these Inquisitor troops were actually tricked into carrying out Order 66 and actually began attacking their own commanders, who were fallen Jedi. But ultimately, Palpatine saw the clones as kind of overkill, a unit that was way too expensive and really unnecessary during the peaceful era after the rise of the New Order. Unfortunately for Palpatine, when the rebellion finally started becoming a huge threat, he didn't have the clones there to help him once again put down the insurrectionists, because there was no finer and more dedicated trooper than the clone trooper. So there you have it, guys. That's what I think would have happened had the Empire continued using clone troopers. Despite how useful they are, I just don't think the Empire could have afforded to replace their entire Stormtrooper Corps or Imperial Army Navy with just them. They would still have to use civilians. But let me know in the comment section below what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.